This is how you estimate time and cost. How much do I charge somebody? How long is it going to take me? Amanda Wozniak said, when you have something working, it means you're 15% done when the fun part is over. So if you, you probably have at least a decent idea of how long it'll take to get something working, and you go, and then assume that that's the 15 to maybe 20% mark, you know, and then you'll have a more realistic estimate, and you can make a more realistic time and cost. Because I don't know about anybody else, but estimating time and cost, things I could have figured out way earlier than I did. And last thing, data. Measure and track everything you do, everything you can, as long as it doesn't impact your ability to do the work. Measure everything, track everything. How do you spend your time? What are your results? All that stuff. Because measuring this data is the only and best way that you have to know for certain what works and what doesn't. And obviously, of course, you periodically want to look at this and do more of what's working and less of what doesn't. Because when you're self-employed, at some point, you're going to be a little more interested in how things are going and how you can optimize, because the very basic bare bones method of does my bank account get a little bigger every month or a little smaller, that only cuts it for the very basic stuff. You know, for example, this is how you're going to find out, do I spend half of my time talking to people about what they want and no one ever buys anything, right? You know, if you and that leads me into my next and last item here. If you find that you're talking to people a lot, you're having trouble communicating with them, maybe you talk to them a lot, they never go for the proposal, they never go for it, or maybe they never don't seem to get it, it might be possible that you're chasing the wrong customers. This kind of goes back to my earlier thing about I kind of figured my main customers would be business and business and tech publications, but that turned out to not be the case. Measuring stuff was one of the ways I discovered it. So here's a few job resource starting points. Adafruit Industries, they make and sell their own electronic kits. They make and sell their own electronic kits. They have a new job board. You can ask for help. You can post jobs, contract-based, all sorts of stuff. Special interest in hobby groups and web forums. I've mentioned that already. If it's an appropriate place to go to hunt down ways to get started and maybe go pro or semi-pro, then you're already going to be a part of such communities. Society business directories I mentioned, personal contacts, let people know what you do, be able to explain what you do and offer simply and clearly. And people who see your work online. This is really just a summary of some of the stuff that I covered a little earlier. Now, okay, that's a quick plow through of some of the stuff that of the presentation. Does anyone have any questions? I know I skipped around some of them, but I skipped around some of the info, but yes?
I have a bunch of questions, but I want to start with what sort of data are you talking about? Is it data about, how much materials I used or how long I spend on a project?
Excellent question. The very short and simple and smart-ass answer is yes.
Okay.
But you're actually, that's not far wrong, because you want to mainly decide where am I spending my time, what things are paying off. So yes, how much stuff am I buying, and are my estimates accurate? You know, you might be underestimating stuff. Do I get a lot of interest, but I spend a lot of time doing a full design document only to have them not go for it? I found out that with some types of customers, that's the case, but other types it's not. In short, yes. As long as it doesn't affect your work. It's just that you'll have to go through a lot of things. You'll have to keep track of expenses, you'll have to keep track of your jobs, your invoice, all that stuff. Whenever you can, whenever it's practical, mark it down somewhere that you can get back to it. Because you will not be able to accurately remember just intuitively, oh, you know, I've been spending a lot of time on this lately, oh, you know, this hasn't. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, well, yeah, so it sounds like tracking your time is very important, and then
yes.
tracking the materials that you're spending money on and what project they're associated with.
Yes, it'll be a little different depending on how you approach your work. For me, keeping track of what I spend on materials is not as important because the materials with the type of work I do is very much tied into, I pretty much only have to buy what I use. But I can understand that if, for example, you were like if you did a lot of welding or metal work or something like that, or something else where you use up the materials, you know, that might be an entirely different ball of wax. What it really comes down to is you want to periodically ask yourself, you know, what's working and what isn't, because I want to do more of what's working and minimize or eliminate whatever isn't.
Can I ask a second question?
Yes.
Can you give me a sense for, let's say you're doing one of these sort of art installation type projects.
Yes.
Can you give me a sense of the sort of arc of the project from, you know, somebody contacts you, you mentioned design documents, what are the sort of phases, how long does it sort of take, you know, how does this thing sort of walk through?
Again, this is my experience, of course, and I'm very much the self-taught sort of person, so the way it works for me is maybe somebody I've worked with before will come to me and say that we have a problem with something, or we're building something and we need something that does this. For example, we've got 2 scanners, plugs into a light controller. We need something that mixes the 2 inputs together before it sends them out, because, you know, it doesn't have 2 plugs, it just won't work otherwise. And then I say, okay, and I'll write a design document which doubles as a contract. It says, you know, this is from me to you. It'll cost this much, it'll take about this long, and here's what there is, here's what it needs to do. It's really so that you lay out exactly what's needed so that there's no confusion. You know exactly what you need to do, they know exactly what it is that's going to be provided. It's especially important when your customer isn't, say, down the street. You don't just meet them for lunch and talk about it, and then meet for lunch and show them something a few days later, and they go, oh, no, you know, like I was thinking of something totally different. You know, if they're in Sweden, for example, you know, nailing that down is really important.
And so then they say, you get an email back, I love it, design document, it's exactly what I want, and presumably the design
I'll
document.
typically have something like, you know, like let's say it's a relatively small job, it'll be, you know, $500, right? $200 to begin with, $300 on completion. Different ways to get paid include, you know, wire transfers, check, PayPal, anything like that. Wire transfers work all over the world. And then I'll get started. I'll send my customer frequent updates, including pictures and video if required. And here's what's happening. And then ship them as soon as possible. I try to ship them something that is a hardware test, something just to make sure everything's talking to each other properly. And then ideally you send them the version 1, they fire it up, it just works, they say everything's cool, it does exactly what we need, they pay you, and they come to you next time. That's it in a nutshell. The other thing I do build and I have in the past built and sold electronic gizmos, you know, small, clever electronic devices, sold them online. That's a little different, of course, because you build them and then you sell yourself the product. Any other questions?
How long have you been doing this?
This time, I've been doing it for 5 years now. I attempted to take the plunge to pro once before, and it didn't wind up working out, and I had to get a real job once again. And then again, about 5 years ago, actually a little more now, about 5 years ago, I fired things up again, and well, now it is stuck.
Do you find that you were working harder / longer than when you were not self-employed?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. I definitely do work more. However, I am also doing something that I very much enjoy. I very much enjoy doing it, and for me, that's worth it. It's also worth taking the risk, because let's face it is a big risk. Even if you do it part-time to begin with, which is a smart move, but if you do it part-time to begin with, so all your work is being done in your time off or your spare time and maybe a vacation day here and there to make a deadline, even if you're doing it that way, it is a risk. You're not getting an employer matched health plan. You're not getting an employer's retirement fund. You know, you're not getting any of those things. You're responsible for all that yourself. So there's a risk for that. It's not the easy way out. But a large part of personal fulfillment comes from what you do for a living. And of course they say, as it's said, the price of doing something for a living is an intimate knowledge of its dirty, ugly, or boring sides. So if you're okay with that, for example, having to find, build, chase down my own customers I'd rather just be working. But it can be done. Such needs for things like this do exist. It can be done. Any other questions? Oh, yes.
So what do you do if you're halfway through a project, you've been contracted, you're working on something, and you just can't figure out how to do it?
That is a good question. It happened to me once. It's only happened to me once. The thing is that if you're doing something that you also, to do something for a living, you have to know what you're doing. It's not like being an employee at a real job, because you're a professional problem solver. They want you to make it work, and they don't want you to come to them every now and then for like, oh, you know what, you want it to work this way or this other way, because there's two ways I can do it. You're supposed to make those decisions as much as possible. They just want it to work. Anyway, I must have drifted off there. Had a flashback or something. Anyway, yes, that's happened once to me before. Most of the time, like all the other times, when somebody comes to me, I may have to think about it sometimes, but most of the time when somebody comes to me with something they need, I already know how I'm going to do it. I read through it and I think, oh yeah, I already know how I'm going to do this. And the one time that I had to throw in the towel was for a job I was doing for a magician, actually. And I was using conductive fabric in this device. The problem was I wound up running into, I've never really worked with conductive fabric before, and I was a little, thought, well, I did some tests, I knew, it looks like it'll work, I've never really worked with it before. Long story short, I ran into a fundamental problem because the properties of the material, they eventually broke down, and they would cross-conduct with the adjacent ones because loose strands would come out, because if I worked with that stuff, or I was a seamstress, or I had experience, I would have known, but I didn't know. I wound up having to tell the customer, because I had the contract, the job was to provide a working prototype, a proof of concept, figure out how to do it, right? I wound up having to tell them that, I've tried a few different approaches, and this was the one we settled on, but